Hello everybody, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Jules Lancet of the Space Medicine and Life Science Project Group inside the Space Generation Advisory Council, and I'm very excited for today's second session of the new Health in Space series, How to Design for Health and Well-Being of Astronauts. Of course, venturing out into deep space will give rise to new challenges, not only to the technologies used, but also to the human element in this type of journeys. Our bodies and minds will be put to the test when we travel to Mars on a 3-day return journey. Just as important as getting there and back will be getting there alive and healthy. So as this is important, how does design come into play? How do you design the interior of a spaceship for an extreme trip? Or how do you design to stay healthy after being in a small confined space for months at a time? What kind of technologies do you use for that? We wanted to explore these questions, and we found the right person to do that with. Let me introduce the expert that we have invited for today's topic. We'll be hearing from Alison Anderson. She's an assistant professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, focusing on bioastronautics. And before that, she had a position at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She was quoted by the online magazine Wired and won prestigious academic awards. Her research interests include behavioral health in isolated and confined environments, and she has engaged in space habitat design projects. She will share about that today with us and show how design plays a role in maintaining health and well-being for astronauts on the go. Now, this is a recording of the session, and I just like to inform you that we had a technical glitch at the start of our live session, thus missing the first minute of Alison's talk. And that is why we dive right into the part where she is introducing one of the two major topics of today, facilitating space habitat design using alternative reality technologies. Over to Boulder, the floor is for Alison.
This has led us to some work that was funded by the NASA Human Research Program, where the objective of that work was to first evaluate the spectrum of alternative reality tools, and then to characterize their ability to facilitate the evaluation of spacecraft habitat design. So first, to get sort of a framework for the
landscape. This conference will now be recorded.
So to first evaluate the spectrum of alternative reality tools, and then to subsequently apply those tools for spacecraft habitat design and see what their pros and cons were. So the first thing we did was develop some specific definitions for each of 4 identified XR classifications. Some of these will be terms that you're familiar with, but these terms for alternative reality technologies are they tend to be used in common vernacular without a common shared understanding of their true technical meaning. And so we wanted to develop a methodology for thinking about their technical definitions. So PR stands for physical reality, or the natural environment. And so this is an environment that has real objective existence that's perceived in a traditional fashion. So we all live in physical reality. The second classification is alternative reality. And this is an otherwise real environment that is then integrated with but not dominated by virtualized content. The classical example that we think of in commercial application these days is something like the Microsoft HoloLens, which you are almost fully immersed in the physical environment, but overlaid virtualized content is presented to you. But that's not the only implementation of it, but it's sort of the one that we think of when we think of alternative reality technologies, at least these days. Hybrid reality is one of the newer terminologies that has entered into this space. And this is a predominantly virtualized environment, but it incorporates elements with objective physical existence. So this is sort of the flip side of the coin to alternative reality. So this might be when you have a fully virtualized headset, and then you're interacting with a real physical seat or a real physical table when you see a virtualized version of that in your visual field. And then finally, virtual reality, which is the flip side to physical reality, where it's a fully virtualized environment that can simulate any of the relevant aspects of the true physical environment. And these 4 XR classifications really lie on something called the virtuality continuum, which was originally proposed by Milgram and Crescino. And you can see that the degree to which an environment is virtualized really lies along this continuum. And there's no sort of true single implementation of something like hybrid reality or augmented reality, but rather almost every environment we interact with, particularly in modern society, will fall somewhere along this continuum. One thing I want to note is that another term that tends to get used a lot in this space is mixed reality. And mixed reality, in keeping with the way in which Milgram and Kushino defined mixed reality, is really sort of anything that is not either fully physical or fully virtualized. So it really is a catch-all term for anything within this sort of gray area that's in the middle of the spectrum. And so by providing these definitions, we were then able to sort of pick them apart, let's say, and develop a framework that NASA could use in thinking about how to develop environments that simulate spacecraft habitats. So we developed this framework that essentially defines relevant spectrums that contribute to a virtualized environment. And then we mapped them to human sensing modalities. We particularly focused on the visual system, the auditory system, and the tactile system. And essentially what we did was we said, what are the important elements within a virtual environment that create an experience for the person? And then how does that map to the human's perception ability and their ability to sense their environment? We often think about these technologies as they apply to only our visual realm. So for example, wearing a visual headset like the Oculus Rift or the HTC Vive. They present a visual environment, but it's also important to note that your auditory and tactile sensing elements also contribute to how you perceive that virtualized environment. So with this framework, we then decided to move forward with some experimental evaluation of our 4 XR classifications to determine what are the most important elements within each of those environments that can be used to develop spacecraft habitats. So we performed 2 experiments, one to assess how people perceive volume in XR environments, and then the other to determine how people do volumetric assessment or spacecraft habitat design evaluation when working in those environments. And so what we're trying to look at is, do people perceive things differently, say in virtual reality or hybrid reality, than they do when they're in a real physical mock-up? And so in order to do that, we had to develop a real physical mock-up. So in our lab here at CU Boulder, we have several spacecraft habitat mock-ups. These are some images from one of our spacecraft mock-ups that is supposed to be a deep space exploration habitat. The interior of this spacecraft, you can see starting on the left, we have a workstation where people can communicate with the ground, provide input, and essentially get caution and warning on the habitat status. To the left, we have the galley area where we have simulated areas for stowage of food, heating, and then adding water for rehydrating foods, as well as a table area. Then looking at the picture on the far right, we have 2 sleeping quarters and a science station in between them. And inside those sleeping quarters would be things like a table for the subjects and a space for personal items. And then for the science station, we have some simulated plant-based, bacterial-based, and then hardware-based tasks that we then kind of asked our subjects to perform activities, and we evaluated their performance. And then all the way on the far right is an EVA egress hatch that we used to simulate when folks were preparing for EVA to leave the habitat. EVA being extravehicular activity or spacewalks. Here's just an overhead view of that same environment. So rather than showing the side-by-side pictures of it, this is everything. So you can see it's actually quite a confined space, but this is the true sort of internal mold lines for current planes for deep space spacecraft habitats. And so this is the space in which we implemented all of our alternative reality technologies and asked subjects to perform tasks. So we had 4 equivalent environments: physical reality, augmented reality, hybrid reality, and virtual reality, where you can see the degree of virtualization, again, increases along that spectrum. In augmented reality, we used the Microsoft HoloLens, And then for hybrid reality, we used the HTC Vive and tracking pucks, so that way the subject could interact with the real physical environment. And then for virtual reality, they used the hand controllers and didn't actually interact with the physical environment. And just to give you a sense for what the first person perspective looks like when engaging in those same tasks, these are the four equivalents where this is a task where the subject was filling up a water bottle. The summary of the results from that experiment is that by having 4 equivalent fidelity mock-ups, it allows to do side-by-side comparisons of what the capabilities are in each of the XR environments. Hybrid reality ended up performing the poorest, but we believe that was just because the physical environment and the virtual environment were difficult to align, and it's something we're actively working on. And many subjects felt it had the greatest potential for future application because of its immersiveness, despite the fact that we had those misalignments. Hybrid reality and augmented reality had more technical difficulties, and so we think that that will again be resolved as those technologies continually adapt and increase in capability, especially when we move towards the commercial environment rapidly advancing them. And then finally, virtual reality seems to have the most equivalent performance to the physical reality environment, indicating that of the 4 environments, or the 3 XR environments evaluated, VR would be the best in order to get something equivalent to physical reality. But I guess the overall summary of this work is that we really find that all of these environments are sort of tools within the toolbox that spacecraft habitat designers could be using in order to improve their design evaluations. The second mission challenge that I wanted to talk about are how to incorporate smart technologies for long duration exploration missions. So there's a lot of work being done on smart technologies, particularly for home applications. But when we really think of the state of the art of human spacecraft habitats, this is currently where we're at. So the International Space Station is the most advanced and longest lasting human spacecraft environment. But when we think about the way in which the operational paradigm for the International Space Station runs, it doesn't have a large degree of automation, nor is it self-reliant. There's a huge team of people on the ground and astronauts in space who are constantly tending and monitoring the habitat and providing maintenance and support to keep it running. Does it have the ability to maintain function without human presence? The short answer is yes, but only to a certain extent. And so it can't be untended for long periods of time. Does that high degree of operational burden really prepare us for the research and exploration that's going to be required when we do want to go back to the surface of the moon and eventually on to Mars? And so the paradigm for a lot of future habitats is to have an intermittently inhabited spacecraft, something that has a higher degree of automation and self-reliance, such that we can essentially relieve that operational burden and enable our astronauts to do more research and exploration. And when we think about kind of our experience in space, NASA really has a lot of experience, let's say, at both ends of the spectrum. So they are very good and familiar with how to develop human-tended spacecraft that unfortunately require a high degree of maintenance and are relatively fragile on the grand spectrum of things, including the International Space Station and the Space Shuttle. But they're also very good at large autonomous robotic spacecraft. These are things like the Mars rovers or deep space probes. Not to say that they are fully autonomous, they're also human monitored, but the level of autonomy there is much, much greater than what we see for a lot of human rated spacecraft. But like I was saying, future space habitats will really need to be somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. So they'll be intermittently crewed. They'll need to be robust, particularly because for longer durations, we want to ensure that our astronauts, they won't have an escape route as easily as they do for the International Space Station. And particularly as we think about communication delays, decreasing the dependency upon the Earth is one of the things that we would really like to move towards. And so we are just beginning to work on a project as part of a team called the Habitats optimized for missions of exploration or the home project. Sorry for this logo. I couldn't find a higher resolution logo. But this is a project that's being led out of University of California, Davis, and it's led by Dr. Steve Robinson, who's also a former astronaut. And he's the PI on this, and it's part of a multi-institution grant. But the way in which we just began this project, it just was awarded and was initiated this fall. So we're really at the beginning of thinking about how to integrate smart technologies into spacecraft habitats. But ultimately, the space in which we're working is that we want our habitats to be self-aware. So essentially using Internet of Things type embedded sensors to help the habitat understand its own status, and then to be self-sufficient. So enabling human and robotic actuators in order to maintain and repair the habitat when it becomes necessary. And so as a result of sort of these two overarching objectives, we have put together, or I guess I should say, Dr. Robinson has put together a team of folks who are all working together to create this hybrid semi-autonomous intermittently, or technologies that will enable a semi-autonomous intermittently habited spacecraft. And this is funded through the NASA Space Technology Research Institute. As I said, it's being led by UC Davis. Also, the three primary sub-partners are us at CU Boulder, Carnegie Mellon, and Georgia Tech. And then we also have supporting partners at the University of Southern California, Texas A&M, and Howard University. The one thing that I wanted to mention is that, in this project, we're not trying to design a spacecraft habitat. What we're doing is we are trying to develop technologies that will enable a smart spacecraft habitat. And so we're focusing on developing data, algorithms, and actuators that can advance a couple specific systems that we're focusing on, including environmental control and life support systems, power systems, robotic actuators, both internal and external, as well as thinking in particular about the human crew and how they will interface with this smart habitat, including the software, hardware, and robotics. And here at CU Boulder, I've underlined number 1 and 4 because that's kind of where our focus area lies. There are 4 research thrusts associated with this project, including a functional vehicle decomposition, so essentially establishing the requirements and really focusing in on where can smart technologies enable a improved spacecraft system. The second research thrust is self-awareness. So this is really the embedded sensors and all of the data that will then be incorporated into decision-making algorithms, which then get used in research thrust 3, where information is conveyed to the human, and then either the habitat itself, the human who's on board, or the humans who are remotely operating, say people in mission control, can then make decisions and determinations about the state and status of the habitat, and then pass that information to our 4th research thrust, which is self-sufficiency. So to actually task actuators to initiate the decisions that were made in research thrust 3. So that could be robotic actuators, both inside and outside the spacecraft habitat, or the humans themselves. And then in order to link all of this, we have to have essentially a data infrastructure that allows us to communicate across all 4 of these research thrusts. So this is just a visual representation of how the self-awareness, decision-making and interfaces, and self-sufficiency connect to one another and are essentially integrated through the central nervous system. I'm going to focus for just a quick second on the 3rd research thrust, because that's really the work that I focus on in my own work, as well as us here at CU Boulder. And this is the decision-making and interfaces thrust. So we are working on modeling, measuring, and incorporating information about the human and autonomous systems in order to optimize performance and safety. In order to do this, we have 4 primary tasks. The first is to, the second research thrust is really focusing on decision-making algorithms, but our first objective, our first primary task is to also incorporate information about the human, their learned behavior, and their state back into the autonomous decision-making algorithms. Our second objective is to facilitate communication between the autonomous system and the human, so that way decision making can be improved. And when we say humans, we're focusing both on the onboard humans as well as the humans who are back at mission control. One of the things that people always ask when we talk about smart habitats is whether or not we're trying to get rid of mission control. That is frankly never going to happen. We always need mission control. But what we're trying to do is to provide better information to the folks in mission control so they can have a better sense of what the status of the habitat and the humans are in order to integrate that information and make informed decisions when we have limited communication abilities, whether it's through limited data downlink or through communication delays. The third objective in this research test is actually on the physical display and interfaces and how do we convey that information to humans appropriately. And then finally, to try to improve human performance and to evaluate trust, workload, and situational awareness as the human is interacting with the autonomous system. So we really are the middle, we're bridging the gap between Research Trust 2 and Research Trust 4. So just to give you a snapshot of where we're at right now for Research Trust 3, one of the things that we're working on here at CU is to develop an autonomous system that can be teamed with humans that will also incorporate an understanding of the human's cognitive state. We're getting at cognitive state through two different means. The first is through unobtrusive continuous measures of trust, workload, and situational awareness. These are traditional measures in human factors that allow us to understand what is the state of the human as they're interacting with the autonomous system. And the second way in which we're trying to get at this is to look at psychophysiological measures. So these are measures either of the autonomic nervous system or of the brain's activity when it is interacting with the vehicle, and using that as a way to get more objective measures of the human state to try and incorporate that into the work that we're doing. With that, ultimately what we would like to be able to do is to dynamically adjust the level of autonomy in order to account for the fact that the human is dynamically changing. So the way in which we're doing that is through actually a docking task. So we are going to simulate with our space cockpit simulator shown here, having a human coming to dock with the smart autonomous, with the environment, with an autonomous agent to help the human track and engage in that task. So in that way, we're going to be specifically modifying the task load, whether or not the autonomous agent is trustworthy. So we're going to intentionally tell them wrong information and see what that does. And then we're also going to be assessing their situational awareness or their understanding of the current vehicle state. The last challenge that I will be talking about today is behavioral health in isolated confined environments. And, we're going to be sending smaller crews, so somewhere between, let's say, 4 and 6 people to the surface of Mars, which is about a 1,000-day mission. And behavioral health challenges in that isolated, confined, extreme environment is one of the biggest unknowns and one of the biggest challenges that we may have to deal with. And computer-based resources, in my opinion, are another avenue by which we can provide care for our astronauts who go on those missions. The psychological stressors and the level of stimulation that astronauts or even just people get when living and working in isolated, confined, extreme environments has the potential to lead to negative behavioral health outcomes. And that's in any individual, not just individuals who have a prior history of behavioral health incidences. One of the things that I have investigated under Dr. Jay Buckey at Dartmouth College as a postdoc was how computer-based resources can provide a means by which we can provide healthcare to astronauts who are living in these types of environments through computer-based resources. Some of the advantages of computer-based resources are that they provide confidentiality, they reduce the stigma and fear of career impact, they increase the crew's autonomy, and then they also have the ability to be implemented in a resource-limited or communication-constrained environment. Again, one of the things I want to emphasize is that the use of this computer-based resources would never be able to replace the kind of psychological care and support that the astronauts could get from their healthcare providers back on Earth, but it provides another tool in that toolbox for healthcare providers to allow astronauts to get the healthcare that they need when they're in these kinds of extreme environments with limited resources. So in order to investigate computer-based treatments, we did 2 deployments in spaceflight analogs. One was in conjunction with the Canadian military at Canada Forces Station Alert. It's the most northern permanently inhabited place on the globe in northern Canada. And it has somewhere between 80 and 120 people working in that facility at any given time, but it's extremely remote. It has high operational relevance and constraints, and they only are able to get resupply every week or 2 weeks. So it really is a polar region analog for human spaceflight. And we also deployed our subsystems at the High Seas Mars analog, that's led by Kim Benstead at the University of Hawaii. And we implemented our computer-based resources here with a crew of 6 people with approximately even sex distribution, and all with sort of astronaut-like backgrounds, whereas at Canada Forces Station Alert, it's almost primarily military backgrounds. At High Seas, we studied a 6-month crew, 2 8-month crews, and 1 year-long crew. And sorry, the 6-month crew was actually, I think, a 4-month crew. That was before I joined the team. But we implemented computer-based resources for conflict, stress, and depression, as well as stress reduction through virtual reality. And these 2 analogs provide different insight into how computer-based resources can be used in isolated, confined, extreme environments. Here's just a picture from Google Earth to let you know where Canada Forces Station Alert is. So it is really quite north. So for the virtual reality technologies that we deployed, they were founded in attention restoration theory. And this is the theory that posits why we as humans like nature and why we find it restoring. And people in isolated, confined, extreme environments don't have access to nature. And we wanted to explore whether or not providing virtualized access to nature in these environments through immersive head-mounted technologies, whether or not that would provide stress reduction and be something that people found as restorative. And these are findings that we have previously published. We found actually that at Canada Forces Station Alert, it was perceived very well by a couple of our subjects. So a couple of our subjects loved it, but the majority of the subjects felt that it wasn't game-like enough and that they had other resources for stress reduction at Canada Forces Station Alert. So they had a movie theater and they had a gym and things like that, traditional ways in which people reduce stress. However, at High Seas, which was a much more resource-constrained environment, it was perceived very well by the test subjects, and many people really enjoyed watching our natural scene videos in order to reduce stress and provide a mental escape from that environment. And so given the fact that that analog mirrors the resource-limited nature that future spaceflight would, we think that this shows promising results for future behavioral health research for human spaceflight. We also did some laboratory-based testing in order to really demonstrate the psychophysiological response of people when watching these videos. Our control scene was in a classroom, which is shown in the left, and you can see that we stressed people out in the first condition, and then we presented them with these immersive videos and watched how their psychophysiological response or recovery was achieved. For our control scene, which was a classroom, we achieved we achieved full recovery after the stressful math test that we gave them, but we didn't actually see any restoration beyond their initial conditions, which was not true for our 2 natural scenes. In particular, our beach scene and our bucolic Ireland scene really showed restorative benefits to reduce stress after watching them, which was also corroborated with our heart rate variability data. And so, this is another example of how these kinds of immersive technologies could facilitate a medical healthcare solution for future long-duration exploration missions. So in the last minute or so that I have, I wanted to just provide some additional concluding thoughts beyond sort of the nuggets of research that I had a chance to talk through today. Some thoughts that I kind of want to make sure that I hammer home are that we're seeing a rapid advancement in immersive and smart technologies. And we're also seeing this nexus of us being on the verge of building the future of human spaceflight for long duration exploration vehicles. And, and I mean this internationally. And so we're really on the verge of our next generation of vehicles while also seeing this huge advancement in technology. And I think a combination of those two will enable us to develop spacecraft habitats in a way that is unprecedented and can allow us to really rapidly jump ahead in the way that we develop these habitats. There are also a lot of direct applications to how this work happens for spacecraft, but here on Earth. So some of the frameworks that we developed for how to use spacecraft, so how to use alternative reality technologies for spacecraft habitats could absolutely be used for developing other large complex systems. And the behavioral health for isolated confined environment research could also enable stress reduction through alternative reality technologies, again, for people who don't have access to traditional healthcare. And then finally, I think the most important thing to take away from these talks is that, if we really want to have a sustainable human exploration program, we have to, not just focus on the technologies and the engineering, but really gear that towards protecting our human astronauts and to help them be happy and healthy as we move further into the solar system and for longer durations. And so, although I focused a lot on technology today, I really wanted to emphasize the fact that all of it is geared towards improving and maintaining human health, which is ultimately the only way we're going to be successful in these types of missions. So with that, I really wanted to emphasize just how much of this research was done with quite a large number of people really around the world. And so in particular, my colleagues here at CU Boulder, Dave Klaus, Doran Clark, and Jim Navity, all of my students, both undergraduate, master's, and PhD students who have worked on this, my collaborators at Dartmouth College, the University of California at Davis, Defense Research Development Canada, High Seas, the NASA Human Research Program, and the National Space Biomedical Research Institute, and of course, all of our test subjects. So with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Alison. This is a great overview of the current thinking and work in this domain. I hear that people are learning a lot. I'm getting some comments already on that during the session. I love that you've shown a light on what you're doing at Boulder with external partners and actually showing it with pictures. These are all fascinating projects. And thanks for sharing with us some of the design thinking behind planning of future missions. I'm sure there'll be questions still for you. We'll have a few minutes left for that, and we will get to that now. This brings us to the Q&A part of our episode, where I turn to the audience. This is your chance to engage with our Alison. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question aloud, and we'll try to moderate these. If you're unable to use your microphone at this time, please leave your questions in the chat box. I see some of them coming in already. It's on the right of your screen, and I will make sure they'll get to Alison. I have a question for you right now. So you mentioned applications on Earth coming from some of these space initiatives. And as you said, we might be expecting more health issues, behavioral health issues, as deep space missions are getting longer. Are you also looking the other way around, looking at Earth-based solutions from mental health care, perhaps even from Earth?
Absolutely. So it's definitely a two-way street. One funding agency in particular, the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, one of their primary focuses is to pull technologies that are already commercially available and apply them for spacecraft, for human health in space. In our work, absolutely that rapid development that happens due to the commercial pull that is causing companies, but in particular for a lot of the alternative reality technologies, that's absolutely something that is, driving the degree to which it can be then subsequently used for space applications. So it's absolutely a two-way street. Mm-hmm. One of the nice things about designing for, going back to this idea of like developing technologies for human spaceflight and then using them here on Earth, oftentimes the extreme environmental performance aspects of really anything dealing with human health, the market is often too small, such that a lot of commercial companies are not as motivated to design for that space. So what we is actually that a lot of the technologies that get developed for, by NASA, by our international partners, by the Russians, these technologies that get developed to deal with issues of extreme environmental and human performance, then essentially fill a need for remote environmental medicine that is not necessarily always captured without someone sort of driving that technology advancement.
Great, interesting. And before I get to some of the questions in the chat box, I'm wondering, so on Earth we see a lot of solutions recently resulting from gaming principles applied to these kinds of training and use of alternate realities. Is that something you're looking at as well?
There's a lot of, so one of the ways in which gaming in particular has been incorporated or thought about for human health in space is for exercise motivation. So thinking about the kinds of habitats that, given the mass and volume constraints, they're likely going to be quite small habitats that we will send people to Mars in, which really limits our ability to take the exercise equipment that we have. We have the ARED, we have all of the, the great exercise devices on the ISS, but we won't have the mass or the volume to take those. And so there's been a lot of really good work done to develop low mass, low power, low volume exercise equipment that can have a diversity of exercises, but ensuring that people stay motivated in order to do their exercise and to maintain their physiological health is one of the things that's being investigated for use with alternative reality technologies. So I know there are a couple researchers in France, as well as here in the United States, in particular out of the H3PO lab at Johnson Space Center, where they're looking at using heads-up displays and exercise motivation, something that you actually see in the gym these days. They're like cycling devices that use kind of like a gaming philosophy in order to increase motivation and compliance with exercise protocols. So yeah, it's something that people are looking at for sure.
Yeah, with these you can bike all over the world, right, during exercise. Yeah, and be teleported to London or Amsterdam. So I have a question here in the chat box from Elena Gonzalez. She's thanking you for this great talk, and she's wondering if the stress reduction method, I think she's talking about one of the latter experiments you were talking about, was more efficient in one gender or age group.
So
she's wondering if the stress reduction method was more efficient in a particular group.
That is not a research question that I have specifically evaluated. We performed our studies such that we had equal gender balance, and we didn't, when we were doing our initial screening of our data, we didn't find any statistical differences. Now that being said, I can say anecdotally that so let me answer that in two ways. One, particularly for the virtual reality for stress reduction, one of the primary measures of what will be restorative for an individual is personal alignment, and this is also consistent with attention restoration theory, which is the theory that sort of our VR development was driven by. And so this idea that, I live in Colorado, I love the mountains. And so if I were put in isolated, confined, extreme environments, it's possible that for me, a mountain scene may be more restorative than say a beach scene. That's actually a bad example because I love the beach, but still, that would be an example where my own personal alignment has a strong impact on what's going to be the more successful immersive environment for me. One of the really interesting findings that we had from our high seas results was that attention restoration theory would say that any kind of urban scene or scenes that have people in them would not be restorative. But actually, those were some of the most successful scenes that we had for people in high seas. And we are hypothesizing that is because, high seas is the Mars analog where we had people for 8 months and 12 months. And we're hypothesizing that that's because that human connectivity and that urban environment, while not traditionally restorative, it provided an escape and a stimulation that was different and provided a variety that they were sort of maybe craving because of their degree of isolation. And then the last thing I will say is that, you know, for our military deployment, our results were dominated by men, just given the environment. So we had relatively few females who signed up for that study. And one of the primary pieces of feedback that we got in that environment, again, because they had other stress reducing avenues, was that that they wanted it to be a more game-like experience. They were looking for it to be a experience rather than a restorative, calming environment.
All right, thanks. So if anyone has a question that they want to ask themselves, you can unmute yourself and ask it aloud. And if nobody's doing that, I have another question here. Oh, Elena is thanking you for your answer, by the way. Bonnie Postel says, for the first experiment that you described, assessing ability to fill a water bottle in alternate realities, did you assess visual characteristics of the participants as because individual stereo acuity and ocular alignment is likely to affect the ability to perform those tasks?
Yeah, so we did screen all of our subjects for their for whether or not their vision was correctable to 20/20 with the use of contacts. Glasses for these head-mounted displays, well, in particular for the HTC Vive, we were worried about that effect. And then when we set up the environment, we did it on an individualized level. So we accounted for differences in height, let's say, of the individual. So that way the visual environment that they were presented with would match the actual environment. So we did account for individual differences when performing those tasks.
Okay. So here is Lusheshna from Houston, Texas, and he has a question. If you are accepting new students for these projects as PhD students?
The challenge is always funding, and so my current plan is not to accept any additional students, because I do have some current PhD students already working on these projects. But thank you for your interest.
It's always good to try, and this is a great platform, as you have described so many of these fascinating projects. So what, with regard to an ethics framework, as you are designing for people and the human element, can you tell us a little bit about some key principles or factors that need to be considered when dealing with designing for healthy humans in deep space? I know this is quite a deep question, but perhaps you can elaborate a little bit.
Can you repeat the question? So, like, sort of, what are the primary things to think about when designing for humans in deep? Oh.
Putting you on the spot there.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is interesting about designing for humans in these kinds of environments is that, you know, the negative physiological or behavioral health aspects are specifically because they are working in an engineered environment that we are putting them in. I think that this differs from traditional physiology and health designing in the sense that you're taking folks who, you know, so they have a pathology and we're sort of understanding how that pathology occurs. In this paradigm, we're taking humans who are sort of specifically screened to be optimal performers and putting them into this environment that is fully engineered, and then having, you know, and it's that environment that then subsequently causes that perturbation or that thing that we're trying to mitigate. And so I feel like there's this, you know, there's this big unknown as to, you know, how to counteract, you know, what we've done to them essentially, and you know, and then like the degree to which, well, how much is good enough? So we cannot create Earth in space in order to protect them, and the only way to really fully protect them would be have Earth in space, but we can't create that. So how can we essentially create a match that is sufficiently similar in order to mitigate those effects? So I think, so in my opinion, one of the perfect examples of this is artificial gravity. There's this idea that if you have a rotating environment, yes, you are not creating gravity, but you are creating a centripetal acceleration that loads the body in the same way that, or in a similar manner to which gravity loads the body. And so I think that that's a perfect example of, you know, what might we be able to do in order to mitigate the environments that we are that we're putting people in. And I guess the other kind of big point that I would want to make on this front is that, you know, because this is designing and developing for humans in extreme environments, I think that's why it's really important to be thinking about this nexus of health, physiology, and engineering, because fundamentally it's an engineered environment that is causing these adaptations. And that's why it's just really exciting for me to see a lot of the collaborations that we have going on between, you know, folks at the medical school, folks in the engineering school, folks in the physiology department, who are kind of all working together in this super interdisciplinary manner in order to address these challenges, because it's such a multifaceted problem.
Okay, thanks. And so I guess that's related also to what I wanted to ask you finally, what your word of advice would be for anyone who wants to contribute to this field in a professional way. I think you mentioned many disciplinaries working together on this. Do you have any last piece of advice that you would like to give to the attendees with this regard?
I guess my piece of advice is, so first and foremost, in my opinion, there's never been a more exciting time to be in this field. And so I would say jump in wholeheartedly, because right now there are more opportunities to work in this field than at least I've seen in my lifetime. The other piece of advice that I always give to folks who are trying to decide whether or not they want to do a PhD, a master's degree, stay in academia, go into industry, is think first and foremost about what is the core objective that you want out of your career. Some people want to facilitate humans traveling into space. Some people want to develop a technology that's going to protect people in extreme environments. Some people want to understand more why the microgravity environment is so bad for, let's say, bone or muscle or whatever. You know, so think about what's ultimately the core thing that you want to see out of your career, and then think about what's the schooling or the level of training that you need. So, you know, there are so many jobs out there that don't require a PhD, but will still allow you to contribute meaningfully to human spaceflight. And so, you know, really kind of thinking about like, well, what's ultimately what you want to, like at the end of your career, what would you like to say that like you helped achieve? And then think backwards from there, what that means for your sort of training progress and what you need in order to be able to get to that ultimate thing you want in your career.
I like that. That's great advice. Thanks. We are at the top of the hour, which means that we have to conclude this second episode of the Health in Space series. I'd like to give many thanks to Alison Anderson. Thank you for being with us today and sharing your presentation. It was very insightful, and thanks for taking the time. As for the Health in Space series, this was our second episode, but we are evaluating new topics for new episodes. If you liked this session, get ready for the next one. In January, we will be talking about spacesuits. We have a whole list of fascinating topics that come to mind when thinking about health in space. But if you have a topic that you are passionate about and want to learn more about, let us know. Send me an email or find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. We'd like to create this series together with you, our audience. So that was it for today. Thank you again, Alison. And thanks for everyone that joined us from around the globe. Have a great day ahead and see you next time.
Thank you very much for having me.